McKean County, Pennsylvania, October 1908. The air, sharp with the scent of pine and crude oil, carried the first premonition of winter. Along the muddy track that serviced the new derricks, men stopped their wagons to watch the Belgian. Émile Dumortier was not building a house. He was wrestling with a monster. An 80-foot-long, 14-foot diameter cylinder of riveted steel, a decommissioned oil still, lay rusting on a crude cribwork of railroad ties. It looked like a beached iron whale, alien and enormous amongst the hemlocks. Inside the cavernous tube, Dumortier, a man built as solidly as the plates he once riveted, was stacking hay bales, not for animal feed, but against the curved walls, creating a thick, 3-foot inner lining of compressed straw. His 2 children, Henri and Sophie, dragged the bales from a wagon, while his wife Adele helped him wedge them into place. Chester Mowbray, a clerk from the Standard Oil Field office, pulled his buggy to a halt, a look of tidy disdain on his face. He was a man of ledgers and property lines, and this was an aberration. He shared a look with Jedediah Sykes, the county's most respected carpenter, who was watching from his own wagon. "It's a damn foolish spectacle is what it is," Sykes muttered, shaking his head. "The condensation alone will rot that hay by Christmas. He'll be living in a dripping, moldy tomb." Silas McGregor, a teamster whose shoulders were permanently sloped from hauling heavy pipe, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Calls it a house. Looks more like a coffin for a giant. That Walloon is crazy, plain and simple." Mowbray's concern was less practical and more professional. He saw not a foolish house, but an illegal one. "That still is technically Standard Oil scrap iron," he said, his voice clipped and precise. "He's squatting on company assets. It's an unauthorized habitation on land leased for extraction." The men watched as Dumortier, sweating in the cool air, hammered a wooden frame for a door into a crudely cut opening. He worked with a quiet, methodical rhythm, ignoring their stares. The mockery was a constant, low hum in the background of his labor. Dumortier's Folly, they called it. The iron coffin. The Belgian boiler. To the practical, woodwise settlers of the Pennsylvania oil patch, a man choosing to live inside a metal tank was not just an eccentric, he was a fool actively courting disaster. What did this Belgian Boilermaker, this chaudronnier from the forges of Liège, understand about body heat pooling and the immense thermal inertia of steel that the seasoned, expert builders of the American frontier had missed entirely? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of those who survived and thrived by seeing the world differently. Their solutions were often mocked before they were celebrated. If you believe in the power of ingenuity and want to learn the forgotten physics of survival, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. I promise that by the end of this story, you will understand how 6 animals and a pile of hay can defeat a polar vortex, and you'll never look at a rusty piece of metal the same way again. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Émile Dumortier was not a carpenter. He had never framed a wall, notched a log, or shingled a roof in his life. He was a man of iron. His hands, thick with callus and scored with old burns, knew the language of the rivet gun, the shear, and the forge. He was from Seraying, a city built on coal and steel in the heart of Wallonia. His trade was chaudronnier, a boilermaker, for the great Cockerell Sambre steel works. He hadn't worked with wood and nails. He had worked with 3 8-inch plate steel, glowing rivets, and the colossal pressure vessels that drove the industrial heart of Europe. He understood steel not as a dead, cold frame, but as a skin. A membrane that, if treated correctly, could contain immense energy, whether it was 200 pounds of steam pressure or the simple, persistent warmth of a living body. He had come to the Pennsylvania oil fields for the high wages, promised to men who could work with the new steel derricks and tanks. He brought Adele, Henri, and Sophie, believing in the promise of a better life built on his singular, valuable skill. Their first winter in 1907 had shattered that belief. It had been a lesson in a kind of cold he'd never known. The cold of the Ardennes was a wet, chilling dampness. This was different. This was a dry, predatory cold that cracked steel and split wood. They had rented a standard, hastily built board and batten shack like everyone else. And they had frozen, slowly and miserably, for 5 solid months. Émile remembered the litany of failures with perfect, painful clarity. He remembered their neighbor, a good man named Thompson, cursing in the brutal January air as he discovered the main chamber of his prized Deming pump had split clean in two, a thick wedge of ice grinning from the cast-iron wound. He remembered the few men who owned a Model T finding their carburetor bowls, delicate castings of pot metal, cracked and useless after a particularly vicious night. Most vividly, he remembered Adele's face, etched with a quiet despair, as she brought in the wool underwear from the clothesline. They weren't frozen damp. They were frozen into solid, flat boards, so rigid they could be stood on end, a perfect, miserable sculpture of the cold's power. The children were never without a cough. The family slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned, while the wind sliced through the walls as if they were made of cheesecloth. Émile had spent a fortune on firewood, feeding the potbelly stove endlessly, only to watch the heat rush up the chimney and vanish into the indifferent sky. That winter, he didn't feel like a skilled tradesman. He felt like a fool, and his family was paying the price. The problem, as Émile came to understand, wasn't the stove, the wood, or the severity of the winter. The problem was the house itself. The American frontier cabin was a brilliant solution to a lumber-rich environment, but it was a thermal catastrophe. Jedediah Sykes built the finest houses in the county. He used seasoned hemlock, tight joinery, and careful craftsmanship, and his family was just as cold as everyone else's. A conventional cabin was a sieve. It was designed to shed water, not to hold heat. Its enemy was moisture. Its defense was breathability. But that very breathability was its undoing in the face of deep cold. Heat, a form of energy, escapes through 3 mechanisms: conduction, convection, and radiation. The cabins failed on all 3 counts. Heat conducted directly through the solid logs or thin plank walls, which had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of perhaps 8 on a good day. But the real villain was convection, air movement. Cold air infiltrated through 1,000 tiny, invisible gaps, between the floorboards, around the window casings, through the chinking, under the door. Every gust of wind physically pushed the warm air out and pulled the cold air in. You could feel it as a constant ankle-level draft. This forced the stove to run constantly, creating a vicious cycle. The hotter the fire, the faster the hot air rose and escaped through the uninsulated roof and chimney, pulling even more cold air in from below to replace it. Families were burning through 20 cords of wood just to keep their interior temperatures from dropping into the 40s. It was a battle of attrition they were destined to lose. As a Boilermaker, Émile saw the problem differently. A house shouldn't be a breathable basket. In winter, it should be a pressure vessel. It needed to be sealed. It needed an absolutely airtight, vapor-tight skin. And it needed insulation inside that skin, not as part of the structure itself. That first winter, huddled and shivering, watching the precious heat from his stove flicker and die, Émile began to look at the landscape of his new home, not as a builder, but as a chaudronnier. His eyes passed over the forests and saw only porous, drafty material. Then his gaze fell upon the graveyards of the oil fields, the piles of decommissioned equipment, the rusting tanks, the abandoned pipelines, and the long, enormous, forgotten oil stills. And there, in a pile of what Americans called junk, he saw a solution. He saw a perfect, seamless steel vessel. The work began in late summer. Getting the 80-foot still into place was a monumental task, requiring McGregor's team of horses and a complex system of levers, rollers, and a great deal of Walloon profanity. He situated it on a foundation of heavy timbers, ensuring it was level and stable. Then, with a cold chisel and a heavy sledge, he began the slow, laborious process of cutting openings. One for a sturdy plank door at the front, a smaller one for a window, and a flue hole for the stovepipe. Carefully sealed with high-temperature cement he'd sourced from the refinery. This was the work the neighbors saw and mocked. But the real work, the work they couldn't understand, happened inside. For weeks, Émile and his family hauled wagon load after wagon load of hay, not loose, but in tightly compressed bales. They became masons of straw. Starting from the floor, they laid a course of bales against the cold steel, then another and another, packing them so tightly they had to be hammered into place with a wooden beam. The wall of hay grew, a 3-foot thick inner lining that followed the perfect curve of the still. It was a colossal, tedious effort. The air inside was thick with the sweet, dusty smell of dried timothy and clover. It was during this phase that Chester Mowbray paid his official visit. He stepped through the door opening, his polished shoes immediately covered in hay dust, and surveyed the scene with an air of bureaucratic finality. "Dumortier," he began, not bothering with pleasantries. "I've filed a preliminary report with the field office. You are aware, I presume, that this decommissioned still remains the property of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey." Émile paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. "It was scrap, monsieur, left to rust for 3 years." "Scrap is still an asset with a ledger value," Mowbray countered, his voice sharp. "You are, to be blunt, squatting on company iron. You have no title, no lease. You're occupying an industrial artifact. Come the spring survey, the team will condemn this structure and mark the still for removal. You and your family will be evicted." The threat hung in the dusty air. Eviction. To be homeless in a strange land just as they were finding their footing. Adele stopped her work, her hands still on a bale, her face pale. Émile looked at the neat, serious man. He looked at the half-finished wall of hay. He looked out the doorway at the autumn sky, which already held the flat, white light of coming cold. He gave a slight Gallic shrug. "The winter comes before the spring, Monsieur Mowbray," he said, his voice calm and low. And he turned back to his work, fitting another bale into the wall. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. He partitioned the vast interior with a simple but effective curtain of thick, felted wool, a material he knew from the engine rooms to be an excellent insulator and sound dampener. The rear 60 feet of the cylinder became the barn. Stalls were built for their 4 cows and 2 horses. The front 20 feet was their home. A simple wooden floor was laid over the hay bale base. A small pot-belly stove stood near the front, its pipe rising cleanly through the ceiling. Above the main living space, he built a sleeping loft tucked into the upper curve of the still. It was simple, cramped, and, to his neighbors, utterly insane. But to Émile, it was a finely tuned machine for capturing and storing heat. The physics of Dumortier's Folly were both simple and elegant, a direct refutation of the principles that governed the leaky wooden cabin surrounding it. The genius lay in understanding and exploiting a free, inexhaustible source of energy, the quiet, constant heat produced by living animals. A living creature is a slow-burning furnace. Every breath, every heartbeat, every metabolic process releases thermal energy. Émile's 2 horses, large draft animals, Each produced around 1,200 British thermal units, or BTUs, per hour. His 4 dairy cows, slightly smaller, produced about 800 BTUs per hour each. The math was straightforward. The horses contributed 2,400 BTUs HR. The cows added another 3,200 BTUs CHR. Together, his 6 animals constantly pumped 5,600 BTUs of heat into the enclosed space every single hour of every single day. For context, a small, modern electric space heater puts out about 5,000 BTUs. Émile had created a living, breathing furnace in the back of his home that ran 24 hours a day and was fueled by nothing more than hay and water. This was the engine. But an engine is useless without a vessel to contain its power. This is where the Boilermaker's insight was crucial. The 3/8-inch riveted steel shell of the oil still was, by itself, a terrible insulator. Steel conducts heat with ruthless efficiency. Its R value was a paltry 1.5. Left uninsulated, the animal heat would have bled through the metal and vanished into the winter air in minutes. But Émile wasn't relying on the steel for insulation. He was relying on it for something else, its absolute impermeability. Unlike a wooden cabin riddled with cracks and gaps, the welded and riveted steel cylinder was, for all practical purposes, hermetically sealed. It was an absolute barrier to air and vapor. Not a single BTU could escape via convection, the drafts and air leaks that plagued his neighbors. The wind could howl at 50 miles per hour against the outside of the still. Inside, not a candle would flicker. He had defeated the primary enemy of a frontier cabin with a wall of discarded iron. The real insulation, the thermal heart of the system, was the hay. 3 feet of densely packed hay bales provided a staggering R value of approximately R45. A standard log cabin, by comparison, struggled to reach R8. This thick, porous blanket of organic matter trapped millions of tiny air pockets, drastically slowing the conduction of heat from the inside to the outside. The system worked in a beautiful, self-regulating loop. The 5,600 BTUs of animal heat, plus a small, occasional boost from the pot-belly stove, would warm the air inside the sealed cylinder. Because warm air is less dense, it would rise. This natural convection carried the heat from the livestock area up and over the felt partition and into the family's living space. The warmest air would pool at the highest point, the sleeping loft. The family literally slept in a reservoir of captured, recycled warmth. The steel shell, once its immense thermal mass was warmed, acted like a radiator, smoothing out temperature fluctuations. It was a perfect, self-contained ecosystem of warmth. Émile had not built a house. He had built a thermos. That winter, the old-timers said the cold had teeth. In January of 1909, a polar outbreak, a vast mass of Arctic air, slid down from Canada and settled over western Pennsylvania for 11 straight days. It was not a storm, but a siege. The temperature at the Bradford weather station never rose above -24 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, with the wind dropping under clear, star-filled skies, the ground temperature plummeted to a staggering -38. It was a time of brutal reckoning. The familiar sounds of the oil patch, the rhythmic clang of the drill rigs, the chug of steam engines fell silent. Men dared not work. Metal became brittle as glass. In the surrounding cabins, life shrank to a small, miserable circle around the stove. Families burned through their wood piles at a terrifying rate. The windows were not just frosted, but coated in a half-inch of opaque, floral ice. Jedediah Sykes, the master carpenter, found the water in the bucket next to his bed was frozen solid by morning. His children slept in a single bed, buried under a mound of every coat and blanket they owned. Silas McGregor lost one of his best horses, found frozen standing up in its stall in his drafty conventional barn. But inside the iron cylinder, a different reality prevailed. The relentless, killing cold of the outside world was merely a distant abstraction. The air within was still, warm, and alive. The dominant sounds were the soft chewing of cud from the cows, the occasional stomp of a horse's hoof on the wooden floor, and Adele humming a Walloon folk song as she worked. The domestic warmth was proven in 1,000 small details, details that would have been impossible anywhere else in McKean County. Adele's sourdough starter, kept in a crock on a low shelf, bubbled happily, filling the air with its tangy, yeasty scent. In any other house, it would have been a frozen, dead lump. Henri and Sophie, their cheeks pink with warmth, not cold, sat on the floor in their shirt sleeves, mending a leather harness. There were no coughs. There were no huddles. There was only the quiet, unremarkable rhythm of family life, the ultimate proof, the small, mundane miracle that spoke volumes, sat on a shelf near the wool partition. It was a crock of jambon d'Ardenne, a cured ham Émile had prepared himself in the old Walloon style. All winter it had remained a deep, healthy red, its fat a creamy white. Whenever she needed it, Adele could take a knife and shave off perfect, pliable, translucent slices. In every other smokehouse and pantry in the county, the cured pork had frozen solid. Hams were hard as rocks, their surfaces pale and coated in a white rime of frost. They would not be sliceable until the March thaw. But in the gentle, stable climate of the still, the ham remained perfect, a testament to a victory over winter so complete it preserved even the simple texture of food. On the 9th day of the polar outbreak, the coldest day yet, Chester Mowbray set out from the field office. He was riding with the 2-man survey team he had spoken of, their mission to tag assets for the spring. Their transport was a newfangled motor truck, its engine coughing protest in the cryogenic air. Mowbray, bundled in the finest wool coat money could buy, felt the cold as a physical weight. They were a mile from Dumortier's property when the truck's engine gave a final, wheezing gasp and seized. A plume of steam hissed from the radiator, instantly freezing into a cloud of ice crystals. They were stranded. The nearest telephone was at the Belgian's place. Cursing his luck and the damned foolishness of internal combustion, Mowbray pulled his fur-lined hat down and began the long walk, the fine, dry snow squeaking like styrofoam under his boots. He trudged up the track to the bizarre iron cylinder, which looked more menacing than ever under a thick blanket of snow, a single wisp of smoke rising from its flue into the still, frigid air. He was expecting to find a scene of misery, to perhaps be knocking on the door of a frozen tomb. He steeled himself for what he might find inside. He reached the heavy plank door and pulled it open, stepping into the vestibule, the area where the livestock were kept. The vindication was not an argument or a number. It was a physical shock. Mowbray had expected a blast of Arctic air, the biting ammonia smell of frozen manure, the sight of animals suffering, their coats rimed with frosty breath. Instead, a gentle, palpable wave of humid warmth washed over his face. It was not hot, but deeply, profoundly warm. The air was sweet with the smell of hay and the earthy scent of contented animals. He could hear the soft sound of a cow grinding its cud. His face, numb and aching from the walk, began to tingle. His hands, stiff and useless inside their thick leather mittens, began to throb as blood forced its way back into frozen capillaries. The contrast between the world he had just left and the world he had just entered was so absolute, so jarring, it defied all his experience. Without conscious thought, driven by an instinct he didn't know he possessed, he pulled his mittens off and flexed his bare fingers in the warm, still air. It had been less than 90 seconds since he'd come inside. Émile Dumortier was there, forking fresh hay into a manger. He saw Mowbray, saw the discarded mittens, saw the look of stunned disbelief on the clerk's face. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement, and continued his work. Mowbray stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the evidence of his senses with a lifetime of assumptions. He looked from the steaming, healthy flanks of the cows to the simple felt partition separating them from the living quarters. He could hear the faint sound of a child's laughter from the other side. He finally understood. He had come to condemn a building, but he had found a sanctuary. "My God, Dumortier," Mowbray said, his voice barely a whisper, all the bureaucratic certainty gone, replaced by a raw, simple awe. "You didn't build a house." He took a deep breath of the warm, living air. "You didn't build a shelter from the storm. You built the calm inside of it." Chester Mowbray's report to the Standard Oil Field Office was a masterpiece of creative bureaucracy. He never mentioned squatting. Instead, he framed Dumortier's still as an experimental winter habitation utilizing decommissioned assets. He highlighted its success in maintaining worker health and productivity during the recent severe weather event, subtly suggesting it was a model that could save the company money by reducing absenteeism. The eviction threat evaporated. The story, however, did not. Mowbray, now a convert, told it himself at the general store. Sykes and McGregor, hearing of the sliceable ham and the mitten-shedding warmth, paid their own visits, their skepticism replaced by a grudging, then open, admiration. But the real spread of the idea came from within the community that understood its creator best. Émile was not a man to promote himself, but word of his success reached the Circle Walloon de Bradford, the Belgian mutual aid society that served as the social and cultural heart for the immigrant workers. A small delegation from the Circle visited the still. They were men like Émile, boilermakers, pipe fitters, riveters. They didn't need the physics explained to them. They saw the airtight shell, the thick insulation, the living furnaces at the back. They understood the vessel. They took measurements, drew sketches on the back of a shipping manifest, and asked Émile precise questions about the hay density and the flue collar. In the February 1909 Bulletin of the Circle, tucked between notices for a community dance and a list of new arrivals, was a single page titled Plan pour une habitation d'hiver économique, a plan for an economical winter dwelling. It featured a simple, hand-drawn schematic of the still, with dimensions, material suggestions, and a brief explanation of the principle. It was practical, direct, and aimed at the people who had the skills to build it. By the autumn of that year, 5 other Belgian families in the oil patch had located, moved, and converted their own decommissioned stills, creating a small, strange archipelago of warm, iron homes across the frozen hills of McKean County. What Émile Dumortier accomplished in 1908 was more than just a clever trick with industrial scrap. He had, without any formal training in architecture or thermodynamics, created a primitive but near-perfect example of what we now call a passive house. The core principles that define today's most advanced, energy-efficient buildings were all present in his rusty iron cylinder. First, a super-insulated envelope. His R45 hay bale wall far exceeded the insulation standards of most modern homes. Second, an airtight building shell. The riveted steel was more effective at stopping air leakage than most modern vapor barriers. And third, the strategic use of internal heat gains. He captured and utilized the waste heat from his animals to warm his living space, just as modern passive houses are designed to capture heat from sunlight, appliances, and human bodies. Émile Dumortier was a century ahead of his time, using the detritus of the first great fossil fuel boom to create a blueprint for a post-fossil fuel world. He was a pioneer of sustainable design, long before the term ever existed. There is a deep lesson in the tale of the Belgian Boilermaker. The American frontier spirit was often characterized by a direct, forceful confrontation with nature. If the winter was cold, you built a bigger fire. If the forest was dense, you swung a bigger axe. It was a philosophy of overwhelming force. Émile Dumortier, an outsider from a different tradition, did not try to fight the Pennsylvania winter. He chose not to engage in a battle he knew he would lose. He did not build a house against the cold. He simply asked an 80-foot oil still to be barn and hearth in one skin. He saw a vessel designed to hold the refined energy of the Earth's past and recognized it could just as easily hold the living warmth of the present. And in the heart of a brutal American winter, the old iron, remembering the heat in which it was forged, agreed. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity inspiring, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten wisdom. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What modern problem could be solved by looking at industrial waste in a completely new way? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and thermodynamic concepts. Any application of these or similar methods today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.